J'ai compris.
Can you hear us?
We can.
Okay.
Yes.
We also can hear you very well.
Oh, good, good.
We see
So,
ourselves more than we see you, but never mind.
I can change that.
Yes, change it. Yes, I would like to see the people.
Yeah.
So, John, I'm looking at the material you sent out in an email about the question of human nature, and there's a fairly long quote, and I'm trying to ascertain this origin of it. It starts out, whereas, let's see, dialecticians emphasize the emergence of evolutionary novelty. Rather than seeing the continuity between human and pre-human evolution. Whereas apologists for unrestrained competition, capitalism, claim aggressiveness, entrepreneurial activity, male domination, territoriality, and xenophobia to be the contents of human nature, etc.
Don't I have a page number there?
Yeah, there's a page 254, but what's the
It's from
book?
what we read. It's at the top. It says, what is human nature is the source. of
Oh,
it.
okay. This is
Those are my
the
notes on that chapter.
Okay.
I'm trying to go back to,
To turn that off.
well, I want to go back to my email that I sent to them.
Oh, you're going to complicate things.
Well, that's my job.
This one.
No, I'm going Gmail. I'm trying to find the message I sent you. It disappeared. It's in sent mail.
Well, while you're looking for that, I'll say that I really appreciated the conclusion. I think it did clarify a lot of the theoretical parts that didn't necessarily make sense as we read it chapter by chapter. They really should put this first. I also went back and looked at some of the practical chapters, the stuff on agriculture and Lysenko and science as an industry, and was appreciating some of their practical aspects. So in the conclusion, one thing that I thought was pretty interesting was the contrast that they do between the liberal perspective, nothing's black and white, it's all gray, versus their portrayal of the Taoist solution, which they say is, and this is on pages 274 to 5. They say is therefore Taoist holism is a doctrine of harmony rather than development. And then finally the dialectical perspective. So that was helpful for me, even though I'm not sure if I agree with their portrayal of the Taoist perspective, but having that the liberal, the Taoist, and the dialectical side by side was useful for me.
Yeah. Could I say something on that?
Please.
Okay. That's one section I had a lot of notes on, because I thought what they said was partly right, but had a lot of questionable aspects. So first, they do say the Taoist tradition, so in a way they can look at anything in the Taoist tradition. Like, the problem is with Taoism, there were two things. There's something called the Dao Jia and the Dao Jiao. And the Dao Jia is the Taoist philosophy, while the Dao Jiao is the Taoist sect, which was it's been a religious tradition. It's a religion, but there's also the philosophy and the teachings of particularly Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, the two great ancient Taoist philosophers, plus philosophers that followed them. So you can find a lot of things in the Taoist popular tradition. For instance, if you look at Taoist philosophy, it kind of makes fun, particularly Zhuangzi makes fun of like the quest for immortality. You know, Taoism teaches everything is always changing and everything is in a state of transformation. And Zhuangzi, there was something like some big guy died and they had a funeral, and Zhuangzi said, wonder what he's going to do next. Is he going to become a bug's leg? Or then he mentioned some other ridiculous thing. And I mean, kind of made fun of the whole thing. But then in the Taoist sect, like the Taoist priests started like making a lot of money inventing potions to extend people's lives and bring them closer to being immortal and all of that. And so, I mean, you know, that's one of the things. One of the problems, by the way, this is a dialectical problem, because if you talk about Taoism, but you don't give the context, the historical context, the context of who it was, what sector of the population, you know, or where in history, you're not really, you know, it's so easy to say Taoism says. I have to say, this is one of the problems I had with Bookchin. And we actually discussed Taoism 1 or 2 years at the Social Ecology Institute, but everything he was saying was just awful, that it was just so reductionist, non-dialectical, and orientalist, and rigged. He and Janet were looking up passages to make Taoism look bad. And they loved this one book about the green sink, was this concept that they loved so much. And it was like Taoism was a means of, I mean, it's kind of like vulgar Marxism. Taoism was a tool of the ruling class to dupe the peasants into being passive. Well, there was the revolt of the yellow turbans, in which something like 150,000 Taoists rose up in one day and you know, tried to start a revolution. I mean, you know, peasant revolutions have not had a real successful history, but that's part of the Taoist history too. And I mean, obviously what he was talking about, which he had done no research on and was just looking for books in the library, you know, and he had sent Janet to look for books. So, you know, I mean, that's part of reality too. And you know, to overlook that would be a big mistake. But the fact is that some of these attributions of things to Taoism are not exactly accurate. Now, there is in the Taoist tradition an idea of balance and seeing things as natural. I mean, there's even one translation of the Tao Te Ching that is called the natural way. It sounds like, you know, something you would find in natural food stores or something like that. And Taoist holism is also a doctrine of harmony rather than development. Okay, this is the big question of harmony rather than development. Well, it's about harmony, but it's also about development. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu, whoever wrote it, says that each being has a course of development after which there is a decline. So there's a, you know, and then we have to accept both. We have to accept the development and then the decline of phenomena. In that way, it's very similar to certain aspects of Buddhism, of impermanence and non-attachment. So these guys don't sound like they know a lot about Taoism, is part of what I'm getting at, but they know something about Taoism. And the merit of it is that they do recognize a dialectical element in Taoism. So I have all these comments. The concept of Tao is developmental. It emphasizes internal development, but not entirely in view of the yin-yang concept. Now, you know, I mean, it's pretty hard to expect, you know, this image of yin and yang to show everything, but at least it shows the fact that there's not a straight line between yin and yang, that there's a flow going on, and flow has something to do with motion. So, I mean, even that symbol, which in a way is not the strongest image of development, at least has something in it about movement. And I think the Taoist philosophy is a lot about movement, and it does have ideas of development. So Now it goes on pretty quickly to Herbert Spencer. So it doesn't say that much about Taoism, but I think it's a complex question, and I think that they don't do the readers a real service in not looking at those aspects that I mentioned.
Great, thank you, John. Looks like Tony might be in the stack.
Hey, yep. Yeah, slightly unrelated topic of discussion, which may or may not apply to what was just mentioned about Taoism, but I was thinking about what I saw on page 262 when they were talking about the phenomenon of eating, and what they say is, it basically the need to eat is a biological necessity, but what we eat is a social condition, or whatever they say. And so the statement they make is what begins historically as an act of mere nutrition ends as a totally symbolic one. So I was thinking back to how they distinguish themselves from this sort of idealistic Cartesian reductionist form of science that we're appropriating an a priori assumption of looking at the world by looking at things historically. But of course, my issue would be that with the condition of eating as a human being, is it not always already a symbolic act? I mean, where did this start where, humans evolved, and when we evolved, we were originally just doing this thing out of biological necessity, but somewhere along the line, it gained a symbolic dimension. I would argue that it's always a symbolic dimension. So I thought that was an issue when they were talking about historical development, this goes back to kind of what I was talking about last week. I think I understand that, like, what they're talking about with their distinction between ideals and abstractions, that they're really talking about like combating dogmatism. But I would just argue that I don't think that it's ever possible to not have like some kind of metaphysical, like, kind of assumption when you're thinking and acting on the world. Anyway, I don't know. I took a lot from that one thing. I don't know if it all applies or if I'm even right or anything, but yeah.
Tony, I missed something you said. What was intrinsically symbolic?
Well, so in this one example on 262, they're talking about eating.
Right. So
So
there's food is symbolic, or what?
Well, the act of eating would be, well, I mean, yeah, food would have a symbolic dimension, because it's food.
Tony, for when humans eat or when any animal eats, or
Well, yeah, that might be a different question. I was thinking specifically about humans, because that's what they're speaking to. So I mean, I would find it hard to answer the question about where it turns from being a biological necessity somewhere in human history into a symbolic act. I would say that perhaps it's actually just a component of human experience, that this symbolic dimension is part of eating. It's part of what determines the biological necessity is that it's a symbolic thing.
A lot of the symbolism is not the food, but who you eat with, who's in and who's out. But the food obviously can also be symbolic, or carry some kind of secondary meaning. But I wanted to say something about the Taoist version of dialectic. I think it differs significantly from the Aristotelian tradition of logic, where things are more separated. A is A and not B for Aristotle. Whereas for Taoism, one one thing is continually transforming into something else, and that there are these intermediate stages where things are very yin as a baby, for example, becoming very young, relatively young in young adulthood, increasingly young into middle age, and then the process reverses. And you can build this this kind of logic. You can find examples of it everywhere, like the sunny side of the street is yang and the shady side of the street is yin. So the same street contains both components. And as the position of the sun shifts, the yin and yang balance or interaction shifts. I would say that balance is maybe not the right word. It's really the interaction. And at some points it's balanced, and other points it's not. But there's a continual flow of energy and position and quality that involves not only each object, but each object in relationship to other objects. And that type of logic actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but it's quite foreign to Western philosophy and science. Or it's certainly a different way of looking at things. The other thing I would say about Taoism is that it does not, by and large, have a social criticism, critique. It does critique the ostentation and the egoistical aspects of human behavior, like wanting to prolong your life and the various rituals that wealth and prestige and power tend to attract. But it doesn't have a class based critique of society. That's obviously true of a lot of other things as well, but it's also true of Taoism.
Great. Thank you, Keith. I see Dan
Oh,
would like to get in. And John, I can add you after if you'd like.
I can have, let me go back.
But Dan, please, if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. I would disagree with Keith about the social content of Taoism. And maybe we could discuss this another time, but the Tao Te Ching, though, for instance, I think it helps to read it kind of like Machiavelli's Prince, like you got to read between the lines sometimes. I think that there is a class analysis there. I was following a debate on Twitter about whether the concept of harmony makes sense in ecology. And Spencer Roberts is this ecologist that I've been in dialogue with, and he was defending the notion of harmony. And he said, what we're really trying to preserve is the back and forth that's gone on between, even the authors talk about, in this book, they talk about the sort of balance between predator and prey. It's a dynamic balance. It's more of a spiral than a circle, but there still is some kind of harmony there, some kind of rhyme and reason to it. And so it's the late Cenozoic, which this ecologist identified as the state of the earth that is habitable, natural, desirable state in the words of Levins and Lewontin. In terms of the logical aspects that Keith brought up, I thought that the discussion of the Barber paradox on page 282 gave me a lot of food for thought. So I guess Bertrand Russell came up with, I'd heard it before, I didn't know that Russell had come up with it, but if the barber shaves everyone that doesn't shave themselves, well, what does the barber do? And so putting it into a temporal lens really makes it resolves this paradox. And they claim that it resolves not only this paradox, but a number of paradoxes. And maybe resolve is even the wrong word. Maybe reality just is paradoxical sometimes. But so A leads to B. I mean, this kind of goes to how I was sort of amending John's "it is what it isn't" to, it will be what it isn't, or becoming what it isn't. So in their phrase, Levins and Lewontin, state A leads to some state not A. It leads to what it isn't. Oh, in response to Tony and the symbolic, I think it might be worth looking at Chris Knight and Camilla Power's idea of the origins of symbolic culture coming side by side with the origins of Homo sapiens, or inadequately modern humans, about 300,000 years ago. And they have a pretty detailed theory about how human beings are intrinsically cultural, how the fact that we have communal food gathering to a degree that's just not seen outside of humanity. It makes our being intrinsically cultural. Speaking of which, in the human nature chapter, I thought that, well, there's a lot to talk about human exceptionalism, but maybe, and what makes humans unique, that's a perennial question in these social philosophies. And I thought that their approach was interesting, though flawed, but we could talk about that later, I'm sure.
Great, thank you. John.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to say about the two last things we've been talking about. I think we need to go back to food. I think, and those are issues about the symbolic, but also, I've been interested in this issue of whether there is a social critique in ancient Taoism, in the Taoist philosophy. And that's another one of the things that came up at the Social Ecology Institute, although most people really weren't interested in talking about it. But there wasn't a lot of interest in talking about non-Western things, but I think the Institute has gone in a different direction since then, which is really good. But one of my favorite passages in the Tao Te Ching is usually translated something like, the way of nature is to take from where there is excess and to give to where there is deficiency. The way of man is to take from where there is deficiency and give to where there is excess. And this is applied to the way society works when, obviously, the way of nature is a certain way that's also a way of human beings under certain circumstances. And it argues that that's what we need to do. And that, there's a lot of kind of mythology, because running through the Tao Te Ching is this myth of the dynasty of the Yellow Emperor, in which all the good stuff was done. But the Yellow Emperor never existed, which I think is one of the great qualities of the Yellow Emperor that made the Yellow Emperor superior to other emperors. And significantly, in Chinese symbolism, yellow is the color of the earth. So we could really say it's when there was self-management of the earth by the earth in a certain sense. And there's this passage about, the Tao Te Ching was written in the period of the Warring States, which was a period of feudalism. There's you have to read some of this as a pretty bitter denunciation of feudalism, because after saying the way of nature versus the way of man, I mean, it's really kind of the way of man is patriarchy and monarchy, and patriarchal monarchy. And it's about all the plundering that goes on. And it basically, it says the fields are very empty, while there's an accumulation of all sorts of shiny things among the rich. And I find these very much about social commentary. And then also another thing you find in the Tao Te Ching is that a lot of it can be read as a manual of guerrilla warfare. It talks about fighting in ways that where you are not seen, and it gives principles of strategy. And it at one point it says the strategists say, and that it approves of one of the traditional things of the strategists, but a lot of the strategies are not traditional strategies. They're very much like what the art of not being governed, and James Scott's work on particularly, the Zomia, this large area in which, the size of Western Europe, in which people managed to not be conquered by the centralized power for so long. A lot of in a certain sense, they were in the tradition of the Tao Te Ching and peasant resistance. Although the Tao Te Ching obviously didn't go into a lot of detail on that. And on Always Already is very interesting. I just happened to be reading something that I wanted to read for a while, an essay by Slavoj Žižek called The Parallax of Ontology, Reality and its Transcendental Supplement, which I highly recommend. It's a chapter from his book, Sex and the Failed Absolute from 2020, which I haven't read the book, but I read this article that was one chapter. And he gets into these issues. I recommend it just because I think it's helpful in thinking about these things. Oh, Renaud, I think you have a phone call. Or maybe, no, that might be Pierre, sorry. He points out that he believes the symbolic order sort of emerges at a certain point in history. Now, there's always a question of, what were the preconditions and how much of it was still symbolic in some way. In a certain sense, once the symbolic order emerges, everything is always already. It's like everything is always already symbolic, except before it emerged, in which it wasn't. Because we know, not all hominids didn't have a symbolic order in the sense that humanity did after the emergence of language. So that's a big question. But if we're going to talk about whatever has happened since the emergence of language, we have to say that once a symbolic order emerged, which would include language and a lot of things related to language, food has always been deeply symbolic. And it's not just, obviously, as Keith said, it's about who you're with, but it's also, it's who you're with when you're not with anybody, because it's a social phenomenon. So there's a community with you if you're part of a language community, if you're part of a cultural community. So this is why, the most famous anthropologist of the 20th century, Claude Lévi-Strauss, one of his most famous books is called The Raw and the Cooked. And, this is one of the most telling and ubiquitous aspects of human symbolism in every sense. And we probably shouldn't go into it because it would take forever. But I thought I might just comment on that. I'll drink to that.
I would say that you made a useful distinction between Taoist philosophy and Taoism as a religion. And I think you're right to say that there is an implicit social critique in Taoism as a philosophy as represented by the classical texts. But Taoism as a religion is in my limited experience, rather privileged. It represents a fairly privileged class.
Like where, in Colorado?
Well, I'm talking about Asia. In Asia, I'm
talking about peasant thing.
Huh?
It was a peasant, thing mostly.
Yeah, but when it became codified as, you could say that about Christianity, but also when they became codified as institutions, they represented the interests of the elite. And I'm talking about, Chinatown, Taoism in San Francisco, Chinatown. But I would like to go on more with the what the question of what is human nature, and when we look around at our environment, the things that seem that strike me as us needing some kind of accounting or explanation or something that you can't ignore is conformity, for one thing. People like to conform. They don't like to stick their necks out. A deep-seated fear, but typically fear of often the wrong thing. For example, fear of Russia right now, which I don't think poses a significant threat unless there are nuclear bombs thrown around. And even if there are, there's nothing much you can do about it. And a willingness to ignore things that are threatening, but not immediately so. So, the lack of attention given to climate change is quite striking, considering how disruptive it is likely to be. And our willingness to just kind of go along with the status quo, whatever it's been. So those are, I think, quite counterproductive, but they are, from what I can tell, rather deep-seated aspects of human nature. And I don't see Levin and Lewontin addressing them. They address them, but they don't address them as aspects, ontological aspects of human nature. I think that I think that their tendency is to say that humans are the animals without any intrinsic nature. It's entirely perspective of where you are and what's happening in front of you that determines your nature, as well as some influence from the social norm. But there's not much intrinsic to it, and I personally find that just unsatisfying. And there are structural psychologies, both Freud and Jung, as well as others, I'm sure. But it seems, and I don't know Lacan very well, but I think he's spent a good deal of effort trying to ascertain the structural aspects of human nature. So I welcome other thoughts on the matter.
Great. Thank you, Keith. We have Tony in stack currently.
Yeah, I think that's a lot to speak on that I can't speak to directly. I was just gonna take us back. I was just had a thought, thinking about like these moments in history, like the axial age and things like this, as representing these qualitative leaps forward in terms of knowledge and understanding. And then I was thinking about an earlier time when there were other hominid species living together. So Neanderthals, Denisovans, humans, and others that we haven't discovered or that I can't think of. And I may be wrong. I don't know if this is set in stone, but the Homo erectus, I think there was evidence of language capacity among them. So back then, if you had these different hominid species together, like what kind of complex interchange? I mean, could you imagine living in that time? It's not only like a different culture or civilization, it's like an entirely different species of people, well, not people, you know, with their own sort of way of looking at the universe. It's, you know, communicable, I would imagine. But you know, trying to comprehend that, I don't know, it's sort of a directionless, rudderless thought, but anyway.
Well, on one hand, it would be more complex than we currently have. As you say, there's different species and undoubtedly different languages, to the extent that there was language. At the same time, the material conditions of those species would probably be much more similar than the range of physical conditions would be much more limited compared to what they are now. So in some ways, I think we would have more difficulty talking with slum dwellers in Mumbai than we would have speaking with another species of hominid.
Yeah.
Just because of the class and intellectual interests. One other thing I wanted to bring into the question of human nature, though, was the tendency toward entitlement, that when humans get some entitlement, whether it's a possession, say, of land, territory, or of a status, they really try to hang on to it. And, you know, to the detriment of other people. And we see this today, not only in terms of status, but just, you know, in the unwillingness to relinquish all the goodies that come with fossil fuel, which will need to be relinquished one way or another within the next century, I would think. But, you know, people really don't want to give it up.
Great. Thank you, Keith and Tony. It looks like John, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, well, it wasn't on this, but the last thing made me think about, you know, using the term people. People have a long history, and you know, part of the critique of the Davids is they don't look at like 200,000 years of human history too carefully, and that people have not always been that way. They haven't always been possessive in that sense. You know, Marcel Mauss wrote this famous book called The Gift, and then Lewis Hyde did a book called The Gift not too long ago, which is about this. He calls in that book, in Lewis Hyde's version of The Gift, he calls The Gift anarchist money. And one of the things about the gift economy, which existed much longer than the capitalist market economy, is that the whole idea was to keep the gift circulating, and that you lost prestige if you didn't do that, and that you know, as many of these people have written, and it comes out in Pierre Clastre, and also, you know, the chief in the you know, the subtitle of the Society Against the State is on the humane uses of power among Amerindians. And, you know, that book and many other books point out that the chief was not the chief accumulator, the chief was the chief gift giver. It was a very busy thing. That's, you know, the only reason that, you know, the chief somehow got a lot of assistance, but only because it was so hard to keep the gifts circulating. It was a big job. And that, you know, the chief would be a failure if the gifts did not circulate. And anybody who accumulated was thought to be crazy. There was just something, you know, really spiritually or psychologically wrong with them. So that, you know, this is part of the argument that, you know, there's this discussion of the supposed anarchist view, which is that people are in, I mean, I wrote about it in the message, so you probably know, but people are sort of inherently altruistic or something like that. And then there's this weird statement that anarchists believe that like the isolated individual would be the most altruistic and good, we would be naturally good. Well, actually, anarchists say that our natural condition, of course, is to be social and communal. That's how we evolved. And to the extent that under certain social formations, people isolate themselves and become these separate individuals, they tend to become more selfish and disassociated with others and alienated, to bring up that word that Dan brought up in relation to the book before. And they don't really talk about alienation all through their analysis, but then they do come on strong with a Marxist, tying it into the Marxist conception of alienation. So where was I going with that? I mean, basically that I know there was something else that I wanted to bring up, and I got off on that just because Keith mentioned that last. Oh, I know what it is. If I can get off that subject, although I think it's a really interesting one. There was this question of they don't believe there's a human nature. Well, they don't say enough about it, but they're not, they attribute a certain view to the existentialists, and they quote Simone de Beauvoir, the being that has no being, or something like that. Well, in a certain sense, they misread de Beauvoir, because de Beauvoir was saying we don't have any being in the sense that it's always becoming. We always are what we are not, and are not what we are, because we're always in a state of transformation. But they overlook the fact that that is a certain philosophy of human nature. I mean, he overlooks that they overlook. I'm sorry, the two of them overlook the fact that it is a kind of philosophy that we are creative beings, and there's this idea. In a way, it's a very, they've been criticized for this, a very Promethean view of human nature. We are these constantly projecting, self-creating, world-changing beings. I mean, that's a kind of nature. And de Beauvoir does a lot in this in her book, The Second Sex, which is a great classic, but it's about that women are consigned to the realm of immanence. That is, they just are what they are. Their being is just being, while the being of a human being is becoming. And of course, there's a contradiction there. This is where, the strength of existentialism comes in the fact that it does carry on the dialectical and, kind of neo-Hegelian tradition. You can't tell a human being that they are not in a state of self-transformation, because they always are. So that when women are told they have to stay in the domestic sphere as a realm of immanence, they will find ways of transcending that sphere in certain ways. And of course, one of the wonderful things that de Beauvoir does in that book is she goes through like familiar quotations from the history, Western civilization. All the nasty things that have been said about women can be read as women's strategies and tactics to fight against the doom of being limited to the realm of immanence. So there's a lot about human nature in de Beauvoir and Sartre, actually. And I have a Sartrean sitting here next to me. He says he's a Sartrean sometimes, but not really, in a very strange sense. But the thing that I wanted to mention from the text, well, that was from the text earlier, but in the conclusion, the dialectical model on page 282 at the bottom suggests that no system is really completely static, though some aspects of a system may be in equilibrium. The quantitative changes that take place within the apparent stability cross thresholds beyond which the qualitative behavior is transformed. All systems are in the long run self-negating, while their short-term persistence depends on internal self-negating states. I mean, this is the next paragraph is really the most important. The dialectical viewpoint sees dynamical, I'm not sure why it's just dynamic, but dynamical stability as a rather special situation that must be accounted for. Systems of any complexity, the central nervous system, the national and world capitalist economies, et cetera, are more likely to be dynamically unstable. Even so, but this is the point, that there is stability. And earlier in the chapter, there's a discussion of homeostasis. And what I like about certain other views is it probably shouldn't be called homeostasis. It probably should be called homeodynamics, because it's really about the regulation of change, not that there's a stasis at any time. And I think given their dialectical analysis, I think they can say that there is a cumulative nature to human nature, but it's not a stasis. It's always in a state of transformation. I mean, I think that is the dialectical view. And, we read Hegel's philosophy of spirit, in which, a lot of those passages have to be read as constant transformation. But on the other hand, there's the section on habit, where there's a kind of summing up and shorthand where, you can assume a certain stability. I mean, I think that's the dialectic position that ultimately for Hegel, reality is substance as subject. So it's not substance in which there's some essential nature there that doesn't change, but it's substance as subject, which is always self-transforming and passing beyond any given essences that may be part of it at any time. At least that's how I would look at their view as being dialectical.
Great, thank you, John. We have an open floor. Well, I'll stack myself for a moment. In this discussion and things that Keith had also brought up, it kind of dawned on me in this discussion of human nature, right? There are multiple dimensions, right? And I was thinking a lot about I think a lot about Fromm just in general, I guess. But and his his idea of human nature, is I guess I might be speaking out of ignorance, but I think it's kind of that there is no nature, right? Like humans are capable of, both horrible and amazing things, right? But in the discussion with Keith, and then thinking about Fromm, I was thinking that there are different senses of human nature, right? Like when we talk about is human nature good or bad, right? These are like ethical dimensions to human nature that can also be explored, materially or genetically or socially, and then this like kind of malleability or perhaps plasticity that occurs. And so so it just made me realize that like when I think of human nature and I kind of dismiss like this idea of human nature generally, it's really mostly in like an ethical sense of humans are not innately good or evil, so to speak. And so that was just a dimension that I wanted to throw out because it seems like there are multiple senses of human nature, and so we kind of even have to clarify what we mean, in trying to figure out the nature of human nature.
Isn't Fromm the fellow who identified about 6 stages of development that humans normally go through, each dealing with a different kind of existential question? If so, that would imply a significant amount of structure to the human psyche. And I think he was strongly influenced by Freud, but not limited to Freud.
Yeah, that's true. I'm not sure about the 6 stages, but I mean this does sound Frommian, and he was definitely very influenced by Freud, but was not like an orthodox Freudian.
Right. One thing
I would say
Go ahead.
I would just say I think you're both right. I mean, I think that he was at heart working based on Freud's model, but he had disagreements, and one of the disagreements was with, as I understood it, Freud's notion of the thanatos, which he or the death drive that he established in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, right? And so Fromm said, well, there is aggression, there is what he called necrophilia, which he interpreted as being love of death and destruction, but he did not think that was an instinct. He thought that was a culturally developed process that came about when we lacked security and freedom, right? So it's our nature to have that potential, but it's not in our nature to have that as an instinct, is what he argued. Marcuse disagreed with him on that, coincidentally.
And supported the Thanatos?
Yeah, that's my understanding in his critique of neo-Freudian revisionism in the epilogue of Eros and Civilization.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly plenty of something, whether you call it Thanatos or nihilism. If we're in a pause again, I would point out that there's some very funny satire on pages 223 and 4 in the book, which was not part of the assignment, but it really shows Lewontin at his humorous best. So don't miss out while you have the book available. He also has this character that a pseudonym of Isidore Nabi, and it helps to know that the word Nabi means prophet in Hebrew.
Could you maybe explain that satire a little bit? I know explaining it's going to ruin it, but I read it last week and a lot of it went over my head.
Well, there are at least two sections where Nabi shows up. One was part of the reading, and that was a series of letters that I suppose Lewontin wrote to, was it the journal Nature, and he was questioning, kind of satirizing E.O. Wilson's genetic determinism, to which E.O. Wilson gives a rather glum response. So that's one section, but then Nabi shows up again on 223 in a satire on the misplaced values of agriculture under capitalism.
We have an open floor. Please, anyone.
Well, there are many, many things, but just to give one example and then maybe another. One thing that I found very appealing is on page 278, there's just they throw out a number of points of basically dialectical analysis. I do find that their thorough depiction of like classical biology as alienated biology. So they give some very good examples of how it's alienated, very specific and convincing. Okay, just a few things on 278. There's abundant evidence that the ontogeny of an individual is a function both of its genes and the environment in which it develops. Okay, well, I mean, we know that. But I mean, obviously, if human beings are a product of their genetic heritage and their environment, I mean, there has to be a human nature there, but it's a function of the dialectic between these things, but there's something there. there are realities there that are being expressed through these changing, self-transforming beings who are human beings. There are a couple of other points, though. The claim that all objects are internally heterogeneous, there is no basement. There are no fundamental particles. There's all this discussion. It's a kind of process view in a way. It's a dialectical view. All previously proposed undecomposable basic units have so far turned out to be decomposable, and they predicted way ahead of time some of that what we're now learning was going to happen. A second consequence of the heterogeneity of all objects is that it directs us toward the explanation of change in terms of the opposing processes united within that object. And there's a lot more on this that's really interesting, including their conclusion on 279 about, a lot of this is about contradiction and the centrality of contradiction to understanding how the movement of reality, let's say. And for us, contradiction is not only epistemic and political, but ontological in the broadest sense. Contradictions between forces are everywhere in nature, not only in human social institutions, which is a fundamental question that something like a dialectical social ecology would have to answer. I mean, I think once maybe we had a list of fundamental questions that needed to be answered. I think that was one of them. Where is negativity in so-called nature or external nature, non-human nature, et cetera? Of course, this is a strong view that some people attacked Engels on for saying that there is a dialectic of nature and not just a dialectical interpretation of nature. So, and this discussion on 178 and 179, although they probably would not have recognized this or maybe even known about it, that actually what they describe is in some ways that dialectic accepts the idea of emptiness as in Buddhist philosophy, which means emptiness of inherent being, or essence, substance, that sort of thing in Western philosophy terms. And that also there is movement by contradiction, that things move through the contradictions within them. So I thought that discussion was really, I mean, I think it's an excellent discussion of what a dialectical analysis is about. And then some other things in that part of the book, I related to things in the social ecology tradition, particularly on 276 and 277. And, what I see as orthodox social ecology, or what I consider to be really dogmatic social ecology, have exactly the problems that they attribute to bourgeois thought. In the first full paragraph on 276, and in the second full paragraph on 277. I don't know if people would want to look at that, but I think if you want to have a dialectical social ecology, you have to take all those things seriously. In bourgeois thought, change is often seen as the regular unfolding of what is already there. In principle, in the genes, if not physically preformed, it is described by listing the sequence of results of change, necessary stages of social and individual development. I mean, at its worst, you get the grand stage theory of history, but also a lot of the kind of teleology, and I'm not saying everything ever related to teleological concepts is bad, but the kind of teleology you get in some of the social ecology texts, I mean, kind of reeks of this. And then on 277, not only this, I mean, okay, this is where it becomes radically dialectical, and some would accuse it of a kind of skepticism or nihilism or something like that, which I don't think it actually falls into. Not only do parameters change in response to changes in the system of which they are a part, but the laws of transformation themselves change. I mean, to me, if you're looking for a really dialectical analysis, look for people who think this way. Who think, in the alienated worldview, entities may change as a consequence of developmental forces, but the forces themselves remain constant or change autonomously as a result of intrinsic developmental properties. In fact, however, the entities that are the objects of laws of transformation become subjects that change these laws. Systems destroy the conditions that brought them about in the first place and create the possibilities of new transformations that did not previously exist. The law that all life arises from life was enacted only about 1 billion years ago. Life originally arose from inanimate matter, but that origination made its continued occurrence impossible, etc. There's a concept, I put a note somewhere on this, about relativity, that a lot of this is about the recognition of, okay, relativity and relevance. we have to do both of these. That often the mistake is made to ignore the relativity of things, which is, it's about relations. It's about how things are a product of relations. They're not just what they are, they're a product of what they are not, what they're related to. Negation is determination and all of that. But there's also a question of relevance, so that there is relativity, but everything is not equally relevant, that there are cumulative results. There are things that we can see developing. So we have to keep both of those in mind, or else things become just the automatic unfolding of possibility in a kind of neo-Aristotelian sense. Or if we go in the opposite direction, things become inexplicable, or they become arbitrary. Inexplicable is what I was trying to, they become arbitrary, they become meaningless, maybe, okay? So we have to reject essentialism, substantialism, inherent existence. All those things have to be rejected, but things are still meaningful. There are patterns. I mean, in a sense, one thing that I would say that they probably wouldn't is there's still room for a concept of a logos in Heraclitus's sense. That within all the changes, there are meaningful patterns of change. So I just thought I'd throw out those few ideas.
Great, thank you, John. We have Dan in stack, I think.
Yeah, I thought that comment was really valuable, and I also noticed parallels with I can never say the name Nagarjuna and his concept of the Thaghata, and comparing that to Levins and Lewontin's discussion of the state A and state non-A, and I definitely saw a lot of parallels that I couldn't quite put my finger on firmly. So I appreciated that. Connecting this to our next reading, which I haven't started, but I'm somewhat, I'm familiarizing myself with Malibu's work, and she talks a lot about habits. And so I thought it was interesting that on the first chapter of the conclusion, they describe, Levins and Lewontin, I'm talking about, describe the dialectical method as habits of thought. Simultaneously, I was looking at CLR James's Notes on Dialectics, which, by the way, is a hilarious book. I'm not understanding necessarily all of what he's saying about dialectics, but I'm finding it quite funny. Anyway, he refers to dialectics not as thought itself, but as a way of organizing thoughts. Another move James does that I thought was quite interesting was he takes critics calling him a mystic, and he says, well, you're onto something. Dialectics is in a way inherently mystical. Well, we could return to that another time. Maybe we'll read that book in the future. Anyway, so dialectic is habits of thought, and maybe we can return to this idea as we're reading Malibu. Now, one of my habits of thought is to go out into the wilderness of ideas every once in a while, and, you know, grapple with ideas that are very challenging and unsettling to me. And even if I don't come to, sometimes I come to embrace those ideas and sometimes I don't, but I think there's a lot of value. I've learned that that's a habit that's really useful to have. And so one of the ideas that is still in my wilderness of thought, it still is unsettling to me, is the idea of no principles of anarchy, as this group has been talking about. This morning, as I mentioned before, I'm in a fight with the local Food Not Bombs group to some degree, because they want to start partnering with the Stalinist group. And I was writing to them explaining why I didn't want to go along with that. And to make a long story short, I was struggling to compose that message without using the word principle, right? I didn't want to compromise my core principles, but I was trying to figure out, okay, how could I write this message without using that word? So what did Levins and Lewontin say about principles? Well, I noticed a couple things. If someone finds it before me, go ahead and tell me the page number.
It's on 273. I think you're looking for 273, the first principle of dialectical view.
So that was one of the areas, John. I believe. So first, he definitely talks about the principles of dialectical thinking, but they also talk about
That's an unusual view.
what's an unusual view. Oh,
It's whatever that is.
the phone is in my bag. It's a section where he says, I can't find it exactly, but so at one part they talk about the principles of dialectical analysis, and in another part they say, well, there is no first principle of dialectical action, maybe they say, or dialectical politics. So I think the point they're trying to get across is, you know, for some people, the demand might be we need employment, and for other people, the demand might be we need less employment. Our working hours are too large, right? For some people, the demand might be more food, and for other people, the demand might be less food production and redistributing what is already produced locally. And so the idea being that really it's contextual. There are no first principles. So I'm not sure how that squares with the fact that there are principles of dialectical analysis, but since we're going to be reading a book about somebody who talks a lot about arche, I just wanted to bring up those passages, which do exist, even if I can't find them at the moment.
Great, thank you, Dan. Oh, John, please.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about that when I read particularly that page, or 273, 274, for principle, over and over again. And I wrote a note that you really could say that the principles that they're listing are anti-principles, because they are, I can't read what I wrote exactly, but that they're not prior to everything. They're not some kind of there's not some kind of paradigmatic origin, and there's not an idea of a hierarchy. There's not an idea of a ruling part. So what I wrote at the bottom was you might call these principles without principality, to coin a phrase, because if you know, in the everyday sense, we could say can a principle be a good rule of thumb, for instance, rather than some kind of absolute. And I think that's what they're talking about. You know, I mean, I think in many ways their discussion of principles is anarchic. they criticize, for instance, alternative health movements on the bottom of 273. Most of the alternative health movements focus on the individual without integrating that individual into social processes, either in analysis or program. Their organizing principle is harmony, balance, or oneness with nature. While in the dialectical view, wholes are not inherently balanced or harmonious. Their identity is not fixed. They are loci of the internal opposing processes, and the outcome is of these oppositions is balanced only temporarily. So there's this emphasis on negativity and contradiction. And in a certain sense, it's a denial. The application of this principle is a denial of, we might say, principality, what principles are supposed to be about, which give you some essence, ideal, substance, balance, unchanging whole or ideal of wholeness, all of which is anti-dialectical. So, the third dialectical principle right after that is the interchangeability of subject and object, of cause and effect. Well, that's non-hierarchical, it's reciprocal. And, to say that there's no, if there's interchangeability of cause and effect, there's no principality in the sense of privileged origin. And it's like the origin is always looked at as the really essential thing from which things diverge, or that there's some telos at the end of time or something, and things should have reality in relation to that, or that there's some ideal in some higher world like Plato's Eidos, or some kind of theory like that, that things are always trying to live up to this hierarchical view. Well, they're rejecting all of that, and their principles are based on the rejection of all of that. So I think a case could be made for them to be called non-principles or anti-principles, or some other term that would grasp, this sort of paradoxical nature of calling them principles.
I'm curious if Dan's use of principles is similar. Were you talking about, you said you wanted to avoid the word principles, but were you talking about these kind of broad metaphysical principles of dialectic, or were you talking about moral principles?
I was talking about moral principles. But I mean, maybe I think that you're onto something, that it could be a semantic thing. I mean, maybe I could have used rule of thumb. It doesn't sound quite as, we hold these rules of thumb as being self-evident, like that wouldn't have made quite a splash. But I got to say, though, I enjoyed, it's ironic that we're critiquing orthodox social ecology using a text written by Marxists. And one of the passages I quite enjoyed was when they call Marx un-Marxist. And this was when Marx talks about his view that it's innate human nature to dominate the external world. And they said that's an un-Marxist view that Marx holds. I'd love to say, Bookchin's view was un-Bookchinist or something. So.
Well, nobody's saying, I think, it would be an interesting hypothesis to say that something he said was un-Bookchinite, but then you would have to find what there is in his view that makes it un-Bookchinite. I mean, it would be an interesting analysis. In Marx, it's kind of pretty easy, because Marx is so anti-Marxist in so many ways, in such strong ways, where he's so dialectical in some ways, and he's so undialectical. But I mean, defenders of Marx say, well, of course, you look at the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, which is one of the classical sources of, vulgar Marxism, reductionist stuff. But he was really just trying to write a popular summary at that point, at the beginning of a work. But then there's another side to that, which is that ends up being quoted you know, like 1,000 times more than a more subtle discussion in Capital, or something in the Grundrisse, which was never even published, that was very, you know, really dialectical. So we also have to be responsible for how we write, who we write for, when we write it, where it's published, etc. Because movements can come out of the writings of great writers that are not their best writings.
If I may stack myself. Oh, uh, oh, Tony, please.
Yeah, I mean, and also, entire, what would you call it? Political approaches can develop out of, I don't know. I had a clear understanding of what I was going to respond to what John just said, but to add on, like, the whole division between Marxism and anarchism came out of the breakdown of a friendship between Bakunin and Marx, and an entire, determination by negation out of that, became ultimately these two incommensurable, approaches to politics. That's all.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. If I may just throw out some minor points, in the course of this conversation, I was, we've talked about, no nature, and it just kind of struck me, this idea of, human nature and like the concept of the individual or individuality, right? And then, biologically, like I'm really fascinated by symbiosis, right? And Margulies and this sort of thing. And like when, there is an argument that could be made that biologically, like the concept of like the individual, is kind of, uh, it's kind of a myth, I guess, right? So to me, like the overlap of like the concept of human nature and the concept of like individuality or the individual is very interesting. And in the sense of like having no nature from an individualistic standpoint, in the sense of biologically recognizing like symbioses, and it's very hard to actually identify, I think, what an individual is. I think that's also part of this conversation as far as like what is human nature. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I just wanted to point out a couple minor points in specifically the human nature chapter. Some things that are in the back of my mind as I read, right, are uh, well, politically right now, there's a lot of illiberalism, right? And the advance of the far right is against like the liberal world order, quote unquote. And like, there's often this tendency from their perspective, right, to lump in, and with the Enlightenment tradition and things like that, right, the far left could be seen as being kind of closer in affinity to liberalism, I guess, than far right sort of fascistic values. Um, but I find it interesting, and I think it's just important to remember that liberalism has always been a subject of critique of the far left, and I think that's kind of being that's kind of getting obscured in the current with the ascent of the far right, and they're wanting to lump all the ills of the world in with liberalism, which includes like the far left, right? I think it is important to remember that like the far left has a strong history of critique of liberalism, and that was and that was present in this chapter, and I that was just something that I wanted uh, to point out, and yeah, that I guess that might be all for my comment, but please, the floor is open. about anything or nothing.
I mean, I'll go and connect it to the work of that. Tony and I were recently in a dialogue with Camilla Power and Chris Knight, the Radical Anthropology Group of the University College London is what they're both associated with. And so Chris's book opens saying, people always say I'm paraphrasing him. People always say that revolution is against human nature. Well, revolution produced human nature, and so their theory is. And to me, it seems as plausible as anything I've read about the origins of humans. Is you look at the human ancestor, the common ancestor that we have with other apes, and it had a much smaller brain. It didn't have the same cooperative eyes as we have. There was a much bigger size difference between the males and the females. They had sharper teeth, and so if you look at the brain increasing, the teeth getting less sharp, the males and females getting to be the same size. These are all indications of a turn towards equality, right? Of certainly a sort of social transformation that I think would be appropriate to call a revolution. So John mentioned earlier Claude Lévi-Strauss and Levins and Lewontin. I don't know if he cited the exact page, but Levins and Lewontin talk about Lévi-Strauss on 258. And for social theorists like Lévi-Strauss, all societies have certain underlying structures in common, of which actual practices or transformations. These structures derive not from genes, but from somewhere else that is not specified, but is presumably a consequence of social organization itself. So I think what they're getting at is let's look at the material conditions that produce these oppositions. John mentioned the raw and the cooked, and Lévi-Strauss also talks about the naked and the clothed, or the what are some other of these oppositions? The wet and the dry, the incest and the marriage, and so he's saying, okay, well, maybe there's a material, this social revolution that happened that produces these, that can explain these common myths. And that's kind of what they're going for. Sorry if that didn't. Okay, that's the end of my comment.
No, thank you. John, had you wanted to get in previously? Oh, well, you're still muted, John.
Okay, how about
Yep.
now?
You're good.
Yeah, I think we should consider reading some of those works that Dan just mentioned. I think they would be highly relevant. I mean, we already have Malibu scheduled, but maybe he could suggest, since he's been in dialogue with people, what would be the best way to get into their views. Some of this we, I guess, touched on in the Graeber-Wingrove discussion, and critiques of their book. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. I would really be interested in those works.
So Dan, was the book by C.L.R. James called Notes on Dialectic? That you
Yes.
found? Yeah, okay. Well, if it's funny, that would be a plus.
Well, he ends one of the chapters. He says, R.I.P. Hegel, and he has the dates that when he died in, and then James writes he deserved it. Like this grudging appreciation of Hegel. It's well worth. I'm finding it enjoyable.
Well, you could maybe identify some sections that might be illuminating and or entertaining.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, maybe we don't need as a group to read the whole thing.
Okay, I remember, if it's okay, I remembered what interested me a lot about this What is Human Nature chapter, and it's the idea of what makes humans innately different from the rest of the animals. And of course, Marx writes in Capital Volume 1, that it's conscious planning, right? He says that's what separates the worst architect from the best bee, is the bees don't plan, but the architects do. And I've always been kind of suspicious of that phrase, both its veracity and its relevance. And so I was gratified to see, contrary to Marx's prediction, some primates do plan when digging for ants, they make sure to select the right size stick, and maybe it's not as impressive as building a building or something, but there is conscious planning involved.
Well, I suspect also that insects plan. I mean, the bees probably have some kind of conference in determining where to build a new hive.
We know that they do. They call it like a honeybee democracy, right? Where they have the wiggling dance that, and once a critical mass agrees, and they all fly to the next place. I don't know that much about the process. Okay, John's on stack.
Yeah, well, let's see. Okay, it's exactly on that. I mean, it's really, I found a really great article on it about the process. And, part of it is because for a number of years, we've had bees out on our land, and we do little videos on bees and talk about bees a lot. We're really interested in bees. And the process is quite amazing, that when the decision is made to swarm and find a new hive, there are scouts sent out in many directions, and they come back with their information, and the information is delivered to the hive, and it continues until enough information is amassed so that a decision can be made about which proposed location is the best. And basically, it's a kind of consensus process in which they're all doing their little dances about information, and they become aware of when enough information has been received about the desirability of one location. They all go there. What Marx said about the architect and the bees, I mean, it's kind of interesting, because the architect might come up, he says the architect has an idea of the ultimate project, but the architect works for some rich guy or something who comes in and says, oh, by the way, I don't want it to be this way or that way. So all those ultimate teleological ideas are thrown out for pretty irrelevant reasons from the standpoint of architecture, while the bees actually do pick the spot that will be the architecturally ideal spot for their community. So there's a word for the bees.
And of course, if we accept the panpsychist view that some of us, including myself, are bringing up and very sympathetic to, then we see elements of conscious planning everywhere. And maybe look at Suzanne Simard's book. Okay, I have more to say, but I see Tony's on stack. I'll come back to it. Go ahead.
Yeah, all I was going to say is that we're aware, but maybe we're the only thing that's aware that's just not in on the joke. Everything else is aware of each other, but we're not aware that everything else is aware. Or I don't know.
Do you mean everything else, meaning other species, or what?
Yeah, and tables and chairs, and I don't know.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Where do you stop and start? I'm not really sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe we should stop. It's getting close. It's getting late here. It's been a hard couple of days traveling from Spain.
Oh, yes. Oh, my.
I met some wonderful people in Spain who were friends of our host Pierre, and one of them sells old stuff, and he gave me two things that are really amazing. He gave me this picture that looks like two peasants from the Civil War. One's holding up a book, but then right before I left, I found out that he had given me one peseta note from one of the anarchist collectives in Aragon from the Spanish Revolution. And I have it somewhere around here. You want to see it?
Yeah,
I
if
don't-
possible, that would be awesome.
Let me see if I can find it. It's in a folder here. If you want to talk about something else for a minute, I'll see if I can dig it out.
I wanted to pitch. There's an idea I'm kind of working with, not entirely, not directly related, but so I was reading an analysis. This is from Susan Nyman's book about evil, and she was defending Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem as a sophisticated political tract. And she says the great, and so Eichmann was probably a much more conscious Nazi than a committed Nazi than Arendt portrays him as. But I think that her broader point is definitely true, that a lot of the Nazi bureaucracy worked by people just doing their job, just not really thinking things through. And so what Arendt did in that book was she stripped evil of the glamour and sexiness associated with it. As she wrote in a letter to Gershom Scholem, evil is like a fungus, and it's relatively shallow. You can just strip it off of the ground, and so she actually was exhilarated writing to this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. It began as a series of articles in the New Yorker because it showed evil. While it certainly exists, it's not. It doesn't have to be that way. The world is still worth living in, and so Nyman comments, fungus after all is not very sexy. And I've been thinking about that phrase because, we know from Susan Samar's work and Lynn Margulis's work, like fungus is incredible, and it transports these nutrients between the trees underground, and it's not shallow at all. It sinks really deep. And fungus is way sexier than any Nazi could be. And I'm just trying to play with this idea a little bit, but since there was a lull, I wanted to share that.
Mhm.
I do appreciate this thought that fungus is sexier than Nazis.
Yeah.
I think that's a that's a good statement.
Mhm.
But I think the implication was that evil is intertwined, like the matrix of a fungus in the ground. Would that fit your idea, Dan?
That fit. I think that is what Arendt was trying to get across. I think that she picked a bad example or a bad analogy.
Mhm.
But this just goes to show our fungi consciously planning, our trees consciously plant. Is there any element there that maybe the continuum with humanity is less stark than Marx foresaw?
Less stark.
There's more of a continuum, less of a sharp division between humans and non-humans.
Is the book that you're reading Evil in Modern Thought by Nyman?
Yes, I'd recommend that book.
Okay.
I don't think I'm going to find what I'm looking for. I have too much stuff. I just took a trip from Spain to here, and I thought it was in this envelope. It's really too bad. I really wanted to show it to you. Maybe next time.
Well, jumping off from the topic of evil, it seems to, and relating it to human nature, it seems that, and I wrote out an email to, I think I sent it to all of you on September 24th, which is worth looking at again, I think. But the one of the components was that another aspect of human nature is that we have politicians, some of whom are sociopaths, and or seem to be sociopaths if you accept that category of human, a category of psychology. And if you don't use that term, you have to use something else. And these, they're dangerous, but they're dangerous primarily because they attract a lot of sympathy and camaraderie from other people who themselves are not overtly sociopathic, but who have some deep-seated anxiety or hatred or something that links them to the sociopathic politician. And this comes up again and again in history, and we have several contemporary examples of it. And that's really where most ambitions for utopia fall apart, is because we have this default mechanism. You could call it thanatotic. There's certainly something very destructive about it, and often leading to great turmoil and war and other things. And this has to be addressed in any anthropology that's going to be useful in our current situation.
Thank you, Keith. John?
Yeah, I mean, I think that could lead to a big discussion. Maybe we should have some time. But I just wanted to show you, I did find the two things. This is a photograph, possibly. Unfortunately, maybe I should put it on different sites and see if anybody can identify these people from Aragon from the, probably the Civil War period or close to that, holding up some book, and we couldn't figure out, unfortunately. If only we knew what the book was. But then this is the note from the collective. It's maybe.
Oh, really? They printed money.
They did.
Wow.
So, of course, it was based on their principles of exchange or non-principles of exchange. From the local councils it came from, and it has their secretary generals listed from the local association, and it says underneath, it says something about the CNT, Senate in Barcelona, although this was apparently probably from Aragon, but it was printed in Barcelona. And the CNT was kind of in charge of coordinating a lot of this stuff. And then on the back, there's a stamp, a municipal. It definitely was not from Barcelona, because it was from Barbastro, which is where the guy is from who gave me this, and knew a lot about the history and had like relatives who participated in this stuff. Yeah, he had mentioned that. It's local from the town where we visited, where this couple was. Extremely nice people. Okay, little story.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing.
All right.
Jumping off of that idea, I wanted to mention a book, How to Dismantle an Empire, by Teresa Coraggio. She lives in Santa Cruz and identifies herself as a housewife, but she's a very bright woman. And one of her ideas on how to address the circumstance that we're in is local money, which could be even created by, say, a church organization or some community organization where you get money for doing some kind of social service, and you can redeem it by getting social service from someone else. Those examples of revolutionary money seem to me somewhat similar to that. I thought I would put in a plug. I would like us to somehow alternate kind of highly theoretical, philosophical reading with some attempts toward, practical, if not utopian, ways of addressing our historical moment. We had some, of course, Dan has left, but he actually has written some material on this. He's shared with me, in addition to Half Earth Socialism, which is a book that we talked about a little bit. But Teresa's book is something to consider in this. Maybe not the whole book, but some chapters of it would be a place to start.
Okay.
At least
Yeah.
2 people need to go to bed.
Yeah, we are at time, so it is it's good to see everyone. We can sign off.
Well, maybe
If-
we'll
if
let
we'd
the
like.
Europeans leave and catch up with what's happening in Colombia briefly or something like that.
I honestly have no idea. I live in a UK bubble. I don't know what's
Oh.
happening in Colombia.
Wow.
Well, you could tell us
Well,
about the UK bubble then or something.
well,